Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lecture of The Road to the Civil War and the Crisis of the Union. This is chapters 13 of 14 in Brinkley. In Amseco, it's chapters 12 and 13. So let's get started right away. Typically, what we're talking about here is period 5 within the United States history guidelines of that. So we see period 5, and that period 5 typically runs from roughly the 1840s through Reconstruction and 1877. So that's sort of like the period of time that is being used in this is again 1840, pretty much right at the Mexican-American War, 1840s through Reconstruction, 1877. Those are the benchmark dates of this. Obviously, for this lecture, we're going to be looking at up to the Civil War, basically from the Mexican-American War through the age of huge amounts of problems with sectionalism and an ongoing battle between North and the South over the issues of slavery. And then we'll going up to the election of 1860 with Lincoln getting elected, and eventually South Carolina seceding. And at that point, we will stop the lecture and then move into another group of lectures in the Civil War for the next set. So that's sort of what's on tap today. So let's get started. Okay, so the big overarching thematic thing that you need to know about this is manifest destiny. This manifest destiny ideology was actually something that was something within American ideology prior to this time period, but it really sort of was put on the test during this period, especially because its expansion of America was so linked to the expansion also of the institution of slavery. Okay, so Manifest Destiny in the Mexican-American War was going to be this new wave of growth that's going to directly attach itself to slavery. Again, we had another really big period of growth early on in the 1800s, which was all about the Louisiana Purchase being created. But that purchase wasn't really had any intent on slavery. It was just basically a way to access the Mississippi River with New Orleans, and eventually it was used as a way to put Native Americans from that old Pacific or the old Northwest and the Southwest. But there really wasn't much implications to slavery up until the Missouri Compromise. And at that point, we start seeing the sectionalism and the issues over free states versus slave states becoming much more pronounced within government. And so this new addition of land is going to be heavily, heavily embedded with slavery as part of this. So it's really important to note that it was slightly different than Louisiana Purchase, even though the land mass was probably about equal, about the amount of land that we added. But how this land was viewed and then handled as a government was widely different. So this term manifest destiny became a term in 1845 by John L. O'Sullivan. And this was all about basically America's destiny to extend the American Republic institution to the Pacific Ocean. It was basically God's will to push to the Pacific Ocean. And not just landmass-wise, but actually taming the land, making it into a farming Christian, an American institution. So that means removing Native Americans from their land, gaining access to this land through wars and the Mexican-American War, purchasing some of this land, treaties with Great Britain was for some of this land, and eventually populating it through American growth. This is a famous painting that was done. You see Lady Columbia with the telegraph was created in 1844, going across the West. You see the railroads moving westward. You see settlers in the Conestoga wagons moving. You see the miners and gold rushers moving westward. You see the utopian farmer, this yeoman farmer with the plow, with the John Deere plow, moving westward as well. And again, of course, you see light coming westward. That this is the big ideology of this picture, the enlightenment of Western Christian American culture, lightening up a dark part of our continent. And of course, who's there is natives and wilderness is being moved off this land. Okay, So the independence of Texas was one of the very first steps in this manifest destiny. So we had our roots in Texas long, long ago in the early 1800s when we bought Louisiana. And that purchase of Louisiana, there was a lot of gray areas of where that purchase sort of ended on the Spanish side. To shore up that boundary, we had the Adams-Honest Treaty of 1819. And basically what we did, we gave up any of our claims to Texas or regions of that area. Basically, we gave that to the Spanish, that the all where Texas is, and a couple other boundary disputes. And what they gave us is Florida. They knew that we were going to be wanting it. They knew that we were willing to go to war pretty much to gain Florida. And that was just a way for them to avoid that and then also shore up their boundary with America on the southern boundary next to Texas. So once this became formally Mexican territory in 1821, the Mexican government knew that they were not the Spanish. They knew they didn't have the strength or the clout, nor did they have this treaty backing up sovereignty. So Mexico knew they could not keep out illegal immigrants, and eventually they knew that they had to populate the area. Otherwise, America would be ripe for America's taking. So the thought was that encourage immigrants from America to settle into this area of Texas, which was Mexico, and to try to make them loyal Mexican citizens to hopefully make it so America would not try to annex it or take this territory as their own. And one of the early settlers was Stephen Austin. He brought slaves with him. Most of the settlers settled along those coastal plains of the Texas and Gulf of Mexico, so very rich alluvial soil, great for farming cotton and other goods that slaves could be used. And quickly, many, many Americans moved into this area of Texas, far outnumbering the Mexicans there. By 1835, we have about 27,000 Americans for just 4,000 Mexicans living in this area. And again, that was okay because the Mexican authorities thought that if we can get these Americans to become loyal to Mexico, then it secures this area as a established region of Mexico, and therefore America would be less likely to take it. And so what we're talking about here, we're talking about this region. Mostly they came in and they put the region right around this river right there, and the region all up and down basically the river right there, and then this coastal area right here. So really, just this eastern part of Texas was being heavily settled. The western part of Texas was really deserty, very not very great for farming at all, and very little economic opportunities there at this point in time. Eventually, Mexico is going to basically ban slavery and try to ban it within the area of Texas as well. And this is where we get the relationship to be fractured. Texas will split up into two parties: the peace party that will try to negotiate with Mexico, and the war party that demand independence. At this point, also General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna became Mexican president and said that he was going to actively enforce his ban of slavery in all parts of Mexico, including Texas. And at this point, the war party was like, nope, we want our slaves. So we came here with the intention of having slaves and farming and plantations, and we're going to keep them. And so they started a rebellion, and what they did, they ousted all Mexican troops from Texas, and they declared their independence on March 2nd, 1836. And for the most part, most Americans supported this decision. A lot of Americans didn't really care one way or another, but if you could have asked, because again, there was racial bias, there was issues against Catholicism, and for the most part, we still sort of saw those Texans as Americans first. Here's this famous battle of the Alamo, where we see several Americans holed up in this Spanish mission, and eventually the Mexican army is going to overtake them. This is the Alamo today. Actually, a quite small structure, not very big at all. Here's some pictures, historical pictures of the Alamo as well. So the Mexicans will overtake the Americans there, and at that point, basically there was an outcry of Mexican butcherism, these tyrannical butchers that just overtook a smaller, weaker American force at the Alamo. So there's a huge amount of like outcry against what happened, and also they used a lot of anti-Catholicism rhetoric within this outcry as well. So what Texas did, because they knew they didn't have a huge number of population, only about 27,000. So they needed many people to join this battle. So what the leaders of Texas did, they basically encouraged Americans from the continental America to come down and wage war against Mexico on the side of Texas. And what they did, they promised these Americans that anyone who had fought with the Texans would gain permanent land ownership and citizenship in Texas. And thousands of Americans came down and fought for Texas against Mexico. The leading general for Texas was General Sam Houston, and eventually he'll lead the Battle of San Jacinto and lead a victory there, finalizing Texas's independence on 21st of April, 1836. At that point, Texas wanted to become an American territory. They wanted to be annexed. Again, they really had no intention of keeping as an independent nation. But here's a tricky situation. If you look at the map, where does Texas lie? Again, at least the part of Texas where they had made it themselves a country. It was all below the 3630 line. So there's a huge controversy because at this point, there was no territories in the north that were ready to become states. And by adding Texas, this would offset the balance between free and slave state. So no congressperson took up annexation legislation, and no president pushed for it either. So this was Jackson, who was in office when this happened. Then we had Van Buren, and then Harrison died. Eventually, we will see Texas getting annexed. Again, right as John Tyler leaves office, he does sign the orders of annexation. Okay, the second big territory addition before the Mexican-American War was the Oregon Territory. Both England, British Canada pretty much, and America both had claims to this area. And at this time period, there was no gold or really no resources in this area, but it was very, very rich farmland. And so we do see American settlers start moving over in an overland trail called the Oregon Trail. You see them coming over in these big, Constaga wagons, and they bring, their whole lives, they uproot themselves, and they sort of move westward in this time period, in the 40s. We also see another group of people moving westward, which were the Mormons. They didn't go all the way to Oregon, they settled in Utah. So you see this massive sort of wave of settlement into the West prior to the Mexican-American War. And the area that was disputed was this area here. This is the area that basically England had said that they owned. And we said, well, we not only own this part, but we are going to claim all of this area as well, all the way up to this line, the 5440 line. So we had this big issue. Basically, what are we going to do about this issue? Both countries had disputed that they owned part of what we considered our country. And of course, people will also come over to California too. There was already some residents in California that we still had Franciscan friars on the coastal missions. And we had lots of Mexican residents, these Californios, these large rancheros and ranches up and down, basically coastal California into the Central Valley as well. But for the most part, California was not a very populous area up until the gold rush, which will be after the Mexican-American War. Okay, the election of 1844 is going to cast basically two people against each other. Remember, the election of 1840 put Whig William Harrison into office. Again, he died, and then John Tyler will take over. Tyler was pretty much a Democrat at heart. He wasn't very much Whiggish, so he was not going to get nominated by the Democrats, of course, because he was seen as a Whig. And he wasn't going to be nominated by the Whigs because he acted like a Democrat. So the two people that ran were, again, the biggest Whig of them all, Henry Clay. And then we see Democrat dark horse candidate James K. Polk, who was sort of a little known politician from Tennessee. Very, very, very close popular vote. You see, it was down to the thousands between them two. Electorally wise, we see that Polk wins much of the big states with New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and Clay just can't compete against those three big states. Sort of rule the roost when it comes to voting laws. Again, Clay did get that coastal northeast area, that Massachusetts, New England area, so that's those Federalist ideologies. He also gets those west areas as well because remember, Clay is from Kentucky, so he gets some of these western areas as well. And here's a cartoon, basically this political cockfight. We see Clay on this side, backed by Daniel Webster. And we see Polk on this side, backed by Martin Van Buren, was the former president a few years ago. We see John C. Calhoun, the senator from South Carolina. And we also see an aging Jackson right there, all on the Polk side. A lot of people will actually say that the most Jackson of the Jacksonians was actually not Jackson, but actually was Polk. And one thing in his campaign, he made two big promises. One of his slogans was 54-40 or fight, which means that he had every intention to take all of Oregon and not compromise with England at all. His other big campaign slogan was that he was only going to run one term and be a one-term president. That he was not going to, even if he was given a second term, he would not run for a second term at all. And pretty much that most historians have claimed that Polk is the president that you would attach Manifest Destiny to. He was outside of Jefferson. He was the president that brought in the most amount of land into the American Republic, with both Mexico, or the Mexican territory under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the Oregon Territory all came into America at the time period. And even though that Tyler signed the order to annex Texas in his term, it was under Polk's term that Texas became a territory and eventually a state as well. Okay, so there's the backstory about where we were prior to the War with Mexico. The War with Mexico was an extremely unbalanced war, with America winning this war in less than a year, pretty much. Okay, the causes of this war. One is that Mexico did claim that the annexation of Texas was illegal. They never basically saw Texas as independent. They saw it as a renegade territory of Mexico. So they said that that's illegal, that Texas needs to be returned. We actually try to buy the area that we take during war. We actually try to buy that from Mexico before we go to war against them. And they said, nope, we don't want to sell it. We want that area of California and New Mexico, Arizona, parts of then Nevada, Utah, and Colorado as well. And basically what actually begins our fighting was that Polk knew that it would be a political death sentence just to go to war against Mexico without any cause. So what he did, he basically provoked a war. He basically took U.S. troops and put them right near the Mexican border, right on them, to basically provoke maybe a response from Mexico to attack them. That was the whole hope. So what happens is that in May of 1846, Mexican-American forces clashed near the Rio Grande River, which was where the boundary was. And here's Polk's message. Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States. He has invaded our country and shed American blood upon American soil. Congress will vote for war with Mexico overwhelmingly. There will be some critics that go against it, namely Lincoln. So make sure we do. I'm going to actually put another slide in right here. Wrong slide. Let me do another one. There we go. That's what we want. Okay. So critics. And one group of critics were the Whigs. Whigs did not want to see expansions. And one big reason expansion expansion equals more slave territory. So that's one big reason why the Whigs felt that this war was unjustified. One of the biggest or the most outspoken supporters of this criticism was actually a pretty recent Whig politician. So Abraham Lincoln was a Whig representative. And what he did, not unconstitutional, unjustified. And in Congress, he will come up with the spot resolution ideology, where he's going to say, I want Polk to, on a map, show us where American blood was shed, because what he believed that America had actually gone into Mexican territory to make up camp. And that when the Mexico attacked American troops down there, they actually attacked America on Mexican soil. And if that is the case, then America had actually moved their military into a foreign country, and that is an act of war. So Mexico had every right to fight back. And that's the spot resolution. Make sure you know that, because again, that will come up on quizzes and also the AP test as well. Okay, Zachary Taylor is going to be one of the lead commanders, the generals of the Northern Army moving into Mexico. He'll fight and win battles in Monterrey and Buena Vista. And this is going to basically leapfrog his career as not only a general, but eventually leap into politics as well. Make sure to make a note of that. This is going to be the basis for his political growth after the war. We also see John Fremont, General John Fremont, lead Americans to oust Mexico from California. And we actually set up we set up California as an independent nation for a short period of time during the war. We call ourselves the Bear Flag Republic. So that's why we also have one star on our flag as well. We call ourselves the California Republic and not a state. We're a republic because for that short period of time, we were our own country. So there's a little history about that. Our capital was in Monterrey, actually. And we actually have near Salinas a few battles that took place. If you go out near Crazy Horse Canyon, you'll see a big plaque about a Mexican-American war battle between Californians and the Mexican troops in that area near Monterrey. And eventually, John Fremont, make sure you make a note, John Fremont will be the first Republican to participate in a presidential election in 1856. And we'll talk about that later on in this lecture. And here's what the California flag does look like today. And we still have the grizzly bear, which is now steeped in California. We have the one star, and then the California Republic, which again, very different. Again, we can compare ourselves to Texas in that way. Okay, Mexico pretty much is losing all the battles. They refuse to surrender. So we do, with Winfield Scott, lead an army, about 14,000 Americans, to seize Mexico City. At that point, we had forced them into submission, and Mexico will formally surrender with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo being signed in February of 1848. That treaty will basically give America a huge swath of land. We pay for this land for $15 million, and we pretty much get the northern part of Texas. We get New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and the parts of Colorado as well. And this was the least populated area of Mexico. That's one reason why we didn't demand more, because if we went further south, there'd be a much bigger population of Mexicans who'd be incorporated into America. And since we were so anti-Catholic and anti-foreigner, we were very sort of leery about adding new people into our country that were seen as outsiders. Okay, that was the big chunk of land that we gained. So all this gray area from Texas, again, this area right here was the area that was annexed. And then we have see this whole big area right there that was part of this claim. This little purchase right there, we'll talk about this in our lecture as well. This is called the Gadsden Purchase. We'll purchase that a little later. Okay, the big consequences from this war was one, obviously, the issue of slavery was going to become a major issue. If you look at this, we have all this new land that's now both, if you look at the line, there's the Missouri Compromise line right there, that could become easily new slave territories or states. So that was going to be reborn with that. Now we have new issues with land and division. We're going to see a lot of Civil War generals who get their start within this war. We also see major political opposition. We see Whigs, civil disobedience, and religious reasons. Civil disobedience, Henry David Thoreau, he was one of those transcendentalists we talked about today in class. He will stop paying his taxes to basically address his concerns and his displeasures with the war itself. And he'll go to jail for that. And that's called civil disobedience, when you're willing to go to jail, get arrested, or get fined by the authorities for a political or social unconstitutional thing that you think is going on. Okay. A Whig politician in Congress, David Wilmot, will propose, it doesn't get passed, will propose the Wilmot Proviso. And what that does, that would lead to basically banning slavery from all the new Mexican territory. So basically he was claiming that all this new territory right here would be basically not open to slavery. All this territory would be closed to slavery. Obviously, it will not pass. It does pass the House, but does not pass the Senate because there is more pro-slave senators than anti-slave senators at this time period. So it does not pass, obviously, because those southern states and those senators would want to have slavery being opened in this territory to allow more political clout as new states come into existence. Okay, like promised, James Polk will not run for a second term. And Zachary Taylor, this new general from the Mexican-American War, is going to be pushed by the Whigs as their major candidate. The Democrats basically will run a very weak candidate, Lewis Cass, and as you see, it's not really even close at all, both electorally or population-wise. Whig Taylor wins easily in both categories. You do see a considerable third party not getting electoral votes, but it does get about 10% of the popular vote. And this is new political party. It's called the Free Soil Party. This party is based off basically not banning slavery, but in all the new territory that has now opened up, basically making all the new territory into free territory, not expanding slavery at all. Again, they don't want to, it's not like they are actively wanting to get rid of slavery. They just don't want to see it expand at all. Also, in 1848, we see the gold rush. Gold is discovered in Sutter's Mill near present-day Sacramento, and we see within the next year a rush of settlers rushing into California to strike it rich. Most come overland, some come by ship, and in reality, most don't discover gold at all. Most claims are not fulfilled, and most claims go basically worthless. But the settlers that come to California are now there. They're going to work in mines, they're going to work in agriculture, some will work on the railroad, some will go to the San Francisco and work there. But the key is that within a year, California expanded from just a few thousand people to over 100,000 people, meaning that once they reach that benchmark, they now can claim statehood, and they're going to. And that's going to be a big, big issue because it would, in theory, create another free state. So in 1850, basically 1849, California applies for statehood as a free state. This was going to be a problem because what had happened is that now we had a balance between free states 15 and slave states 15, and this would upset the balance. So Southerners immediately call foul. They say, nope, we can't have California in, and they even threaten secession if California is let in as a free state. So to avoid that, Henry Clay will come up with a new compromise to deal with this, along with help from Daniel Webster and um, and Stephen Douglas. So these three politicians are going to come up with this plan to bring California in as a free state with compromises given to the Southerners to deal with that new lack of balance. Okay, here's the thing. So California becomes the free states, number one. Secondly, is that there will be a new and expanded fugitive slave law called the Fugitive Slave Act, which will make it much easier for Southerners to go into the North and capture runaway slaves. That was going to be extremely contentious. This is going to be a huge issue that's going to be debated about, and many abolitionists are going to basically push back against this as well. It will also ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C., not slavery, just the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And the fourth thing it does, basically all this new purple territory, all this Mexican territory from the Mexicans in secession, this Utah and New Mexico territory, is now going to be opened up to slavery through something called popular sovereignty, meaning that the locals of those territories can vote to either have slavery or not to have slavery. It's going to be up to the people to choose, not the Missouri Compromise line. So that basically breaks this Missouri Compromise, saying that, well, we now can have territory in Mexico, the Mexican secession, that is up for vote rather than just be based on where you are geographically. In reality, it's not going to be a big issue, though, because if you think about what's in those territories, you look at New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, there's not much farming. There's not really any ability to have big plantations. So there's going to be very little use or need for slaves in those areas. So we're not going to see a major push to ever make those areas slaved. Many people thought this compromise would be a guarantee for peace for another generation. In reality, the compromise will fall apart really, really quickly. Douglas, there's a famous quote that he stated in his opposition to the fugitive slave law. The only way to make a fugitive slave law a dead letter is to make a half a dozen more dead kidnappers. So basically, he's advocating to, if you see a slave catcher, run them off, murder them, kill them, harass them, doesn't matter. We also see Harriet Beecher Stowe write her famous Uncle Tom's Cabin in opposition to this fugitive slave law as well. And that is going to be copied and published hundreds of thousands of times, and really seen as sort of a cantankerous pro-abolitionist periodical / novel that is going to really start pissing off the Southerners. That they're thinking that, well, all Northerners really have the view of wanting to be abolitionists. Okay, so that is today's lecture, the part one of today's lecture, and we'll do the rest in our second part. Okay, you guys have a great afternoon and a great evening, and we'll talk to you later. Bye all.